Now let's talk more about loans, but this one is for the public sector. That's for Nigeria as a whole. We know that for Nigeria, the financial statement was published. It circulated yesterday, published by World Bank. It placed Nigeria as the third largest debtor to the bank's International Development Association, that's the IDA, as at June 2024. According to the financial statement, Nigeria's exposure to IDA rose to $16.5 billion as at June, which is an increase of about 2.2 billion in percentage. That's about 14.4 over what it used to be, 14.3 billion recorded at the end of last year, 2023. Now, before then, as the DMO had released that as of June, the same June 2024, Nigeria's public debt was at 121.67 trillion naira. That's about $91.46 billion. That was according to the DMO. Nigeria's debt went up. In 3 months, we incurred 24.33 trillion naira. Now we are talking of subsidy or not, new price for petrol, and we know that subsidy is a major one for this. Also, the federal government just concluded the first dollar bond, $500 million. So while that is an investment for the private sector and individuals and institutional investors, it is debt on the government ledger. So this is added to that. So by the end of perhaps this month, we would add at least $500 million to what we're already owing. They have said that owing or getting debt is normal in business. But I guess the question is, what is the fund being used for? I guess that's it. Well, let's discuss this now with an individual who can help us to understand. He is the co-convener of African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. He's also assistant professor at the Zulik School of Law in Dalhousie University in Canada. Prof, good morning and thank you for your time.
Good morning. How are you?
Great. So we do hear these numbers, which are staggering, but I mean, we're talking about a country now. We're not talking of a company now, that we're talking about individuals. And I mean, even America does owe. But the question I think that bothers on the mind of a lot of Nigerians is, what are the funds being used for? For instance, do we know exactly what the $500 million, which has been collected now, I believe, from the first Eurobond, from the first dollar bond, not Eurobond, the first dollar bond of the federal government. Do we know what is being targeted at? Can we measure, the usage at the end of a time frame?
Thank you very much, Ini. So your question goes to the heart of one of the issues that has been a challenge for management of debt. In Nigeria and indeed across many other countries. That indeed is about issues of transparency and accountability. These issues are not new. While it is not impossible to say, for example, in the context of, as you said at the top of the interview, International Development Association, the type of funds that the World Bank gives through that institution are aimed at issues such as socioeconomic policies, rural development, private business, and sustainable environmental policies, amongst others. Indeed, tracing how they have been used is a challenge. And that's where we do talk about debts that are bad debts, because the mechanism at the national level, the legal mechanism in particular, by which government should otherwise be accountable and ensure that transparency in the spending of these monies are there and accountable to the public and not otherwise strictly enforced.
So how do we go about this now? We got all excited and all when the dollar bond came out, but I mean, I don't think a lot of people have asked the question, so what is this bond targeted at? And this, of course, is, I think most of what we hear actually is funding of the budget. And we expect that should go into infrastructure, but it does seem at the end of the day that they go into recurrent expenses.
Yeah, that's true. The adverts will tell you that, we need this to address shortfalls in our budget deficit. Again, the origin of that is the fact that we already have debts at profile rates that are compounding, which means a significant amount of the revenue we generate, almost I think about 90% of that is actually used to service our debt. So debt unsustainability is a challenge. And so it's not unusual for governments to reach out, whether through the private debt bond or to reach out for more funds from international financial institutions to augment those shortfalls, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in education, whether it's in, other development, socioeconomic development programs that have been promised by the government. So generally, that's the idea when governments reach out about that. But where the bigger issues lie is the fact that these are not necessarily monitored at the end. And so there's a challenge of saying, if we are paying as much as 90% of debt service, for example, for the public one, how are we going to ensure that these additional monies that are being raised are going to do those specific things we expect them to do? In Nigeria, health, education, public infrastructure are a huge challenge, right? These are part from areas where government needs to support rural development in farming, where we need to augment, the shortfalls in food and reduce the cost of getting daily rates, as we know inflation very high. So all these are the ideas that the government targets through these pools of funds that are put together. But as I said, accountability and lack of transparency are indeed challenges that really make these issues very unsustainable, as an example of pursuing good debt.
So what's the responsibility of the citizens now? What can the citizens do?
The citizens have a duty to be informed. That is the first thing. It is easy to point at examples of what can be done, but I think the first point is most people are not enlightened enough about the impact of debt profile on their day-to-day living, because it really means that the space that the government has, the fiscal space the government has to do things that impact us may be significantly constrained. And so whether it's at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, they want to ask questions. Ask questions through their representatives. Ask questions through civil society organizations that exist that cater to those kind of issues. And I think once those kind of channels are used, that is one great example. But let me give you another great example that we have done at the African Sovereignty Justice Network. And this is about Kenya in particular. What we did, which I think deserves a lot more attention actually, is that we've gone to court. And it's not unusual in Nigeria as well to ask for information about how the government has used these resources. Now, we know that that's a challenge once you land in the doors of the courts, because their dockets are filled with many cases. But it shouldn't stop us from asking these questions and holding our leaders accountable.
The need for citizens to be involved is what happened with China. We know the president is now in China, and we hope that to be resolved. None of our aircraft or other property will be overtaken. But as you said, the people need to be more involved in this. So at least the government will know that people are watching and people are talking.
Yes, I mean, FUCAC is going on in China, and I think that has its own bucket, because it's again shown that not just Nigeria, African leaders never really are trying to think about the future of Africa by themselves. The strategies that are developed by various economically powerful states across the world, we see, on China, and I'll leave it. You wonder why almost 43 African leaders have to file up in China because we're looking for funds. Do they do that in Africa? But we can leave that aside and come back to the question of the debt. And I think it's critical. We don't want chaos to ensue when citizens are trying to hold government accountable. We've seen this in Kenya recently, where a finance bill turned to days and days of protests that led to destruction of public infrastructure. That comes back to the people at the end of the day. We don't want that in Nigeria. What we want is responsible accountability, responsible questioning. And like I said, oftentimes for the person on the street, the federal government is not the closest person to you. Your local government chairperson or LCDA chairperson is likely that person, or your representative at the state or federal level. And so those are the kind of social related information that I think also needs to be available to people so that they know they can do this, right? Of course, in addition to that, there are institutional measures that can be taken by, like I have said, civil society organizations, and the African Sovereign Justice Network is doing that as far as it can on the continental level, and it's specific to about 6 states. But these are measures that we must take. There is no shortcut to holding government accountable other than request and request and request through every legal means.
Yeah, and just before we let you go, I guess we should also know that the status of Nigeria, that Nigeria's debt status, is not in very bad lights. We still have windows to borrow, but I mean, it just boils down to being intentional in our borrowing.
Indeed, indeed. Borrowing is not bad. Governments across the world do it. What is our challenge is the fact that we borrow almost to a way in which, we render our economic almost, suffering from significant levels of malnutrition, economic-wise, is what I mean. And so if this is not there, then, servicing our debts, which consume, again, like I said, almost 90% of Nigeria's revenue, the unsustainability of it means we have a huge challenge, realizing a lot of those critical socioeconomic development agenda that the government has. That's where we need to focus to channel again all the legal means we have in Nigeria, and we have a lot of them in our laws, to ensure that these debts are being used appropriately. But lastly, I would also say that there is a corresponding obligation, which is not to this conversation, we've had this in the past, on the international financial institutions that just dump these debts on our country. Notwithstanding the favorable loans, terms on which some of them may be gotten, like the IDA that you're talking about, it is still a responsibility they have to ensure that these countries, such as Nigeria, for example, is going through significant challenges, and that compounding our economic wellness by just dumping these debts on us, even though we ask for them, may not always be the way forward.
All right, Prof, thank you so much for that. Professor Akingbe, Olabisi Akingbe is the co-convener of African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. Thank you for your views this morning.
Thank you very much.